This sixth presentation is on how to create regional change with community conservation, showing examples from Belize, India, Madagascar, and Peru. If you plan ahead, you can develop community conservation projects that can lead to positive regional change for almost the same amount of effort that it takes to do one community project. There are many myths and paradoxes that we explored in an earlier presentation. Some of the facts seem to go against common sense or intuition, but we have found them to be important. Rural people are the solution, not the problem. Although they may be poor, they do not respond only to economic incentives. How they treat the environment depends on how they think, or that they come to think, not on their economic circumstances. Often, it is rich people who respond more to economic incentives. From the last presentation, you know that community conservation projects are extremely cost-effective and can be successful on $10,000 to $20,000 US per year, and can protect forests for less than 50 cents per hectare per year. This presentation will tell how small community projects can be used as building blocks to successfully affect country-wide or regional change. Although I had a serendipitous beginning into community conservation, I found it to be a powerful solution to the alarming environmental degradation and loss of biodiversity occurring in the world today. A successful community project depends on helping the community to develop an empowered community group with a coordinator as a minimal staff. When done correctly, it can lead to protection of landscapes at a very reasonable cost. As you learned in other presentations, it is better to enter a community by invitation. Although one focuses on a species for convenience and interest, you must look at the whole ecosystem and the whole region. And if you plan ahead, such a project can have a major regional effect. You have already heard about the Community Baboon Sanctuary in other presentations. Its effects as a model project influence policy for community co-management in Belize. It is ongoing and depends on voluntary pledges by landowners. Although we discussed holistic project evaluation in other presentations, the bottom level of evaluation is whether or not the fauna and flora are flourishing. In the Community Baboon Sanctuary, the howler population has increased dramatically since we began the conservation project. However, a recent study of the forest cover has shown that deforestation has occurred in 15 years from 1989 to 2004 by 23%, which is a problem. So in those 15 years, there's a trend toward greater forest fragmentation, but the connectivity is still high, indicating that there is still connections for the howler population to interact with each other and to maintain genetic flow. However, the situation is probably fragile, and some recatalyzation and developing tools such as easements on the private lands might be important to try. The real success of the Community Baboon Sanctuary was as a model that moved the small country of Belize to adopt the policy of community co-management of their protected areas. This was what I refer to as conservation contagion. Over a dozen communities signed memoranda of understanding with the government of Belize under the forestry or fisheries departments. This map shows the Community Baboon Sanctuary location, the red arrow, and the locations of the community co-managed protected areas, blue dots, which are distributed throughout the country and its reef areas. As mentioned in other presentations, the level of community participation is most important, with a gradation from high government authority to high community authority. Community co-management and indigenous management are the highest community participation levels with ownership of the project residing with the community. This definition of co-management by Pimbert and Priddy is good, emphasizing the sharing of control and decision-making by local users with government. Co means equal. Belize's conservation history has been studied with co-management. The Belize Audubon Society, that began as a birding club under the Florida Audubon Society in 1969, began developing as a conservation organization as we were just beginning the community baboon sanctuary. They were charged by the government of Belize to co-manage a number of early protected areas, including the Coxcomb Basin Wildlife Sanctuary. Community Conservation initiated a 3-year medium-sized United Nations grant for $750,000 US to develop a community co-managed protected area subsystem. The grant was obtained for the Protected Areas Conservation Trust, and the project began in 1999 with CC staff as advisors, then having 15 years experience working with Belizean communities. The project was to work with Gales Point, Five Blues National Park, Agua Caliente Wildlife Sanctuary, and Freshwater Creek. In addition, under our original proposal, we proposed to develop an umbrella organization of the community-managed protected areas with a series of meetings and a newsletter. Unfortunately, after 6 months, it was decided to terminate our participation, and the project, managed by a young Belizean coordinator with little experience in community conservation, failed to do what we had projected the project to do. With that failure, it was no longer possible to get additional funds, leaving the communities with little support. In 2003, we began to work with Matt Miller and the Peace Corps to try and recatalyze community co-management through the use of Peace Corps volunteers as individual project coordinators. We led workshops for the Peace Corps and communities. With the promise of success in Belize, I tried some of the community concepts from Belize in Wisconsin, starting with the Ferry Bluff Eagle Council. Of these 6 projects initiated in southern Wisconsin, all but the ornate box turtle project have empowered community groups managing their programs. The Kickapoo Valley Reserve served as a model for the Badger Army ammunition plant lands, and both have become state-coordinated protected areas. The concept of a biological extension agent developed in the Blue Mounds project has been additionally used in the Kickapoo Valley. I first visited India in 1967 and 68, working as a postdoctoral scholar for the Smithsonian Institution to bring Indian and U.S. researchers together to develop collaborative projects in India. It was during that time that I saw my first golden langur in the Manas area. I returned to India in 1997 as a volunteer advisor to the Indo-U.S. Primate Project and traveled to Assam to contact regional NGOs and to plan a project focused on the golden langur's protection. In 1997, when I returned to India and to Assam, the golden langur was considered the most endangered of India's primates. There had been a great deal of deforestation due to a complex political situation, including militants in the forest seeking autonomy for a tribal state. From the above geographic range map of the golden langur by Dr. Anwaruddin Chowdhury, you can see that the current range in green has been radically reduced from the original range in gray. The red represents the range in 1970 and the yellow is the range in 1990. What is very obvious is the isolation of a number of large fragments in the southern part of the range. This brief history of recent events lets you see how complicated the political situation was when we started the project in 1998. The militant groups in the forest threatened the Assam Forest Department staff and caused the ethnic violence and ultimately led to the 50% deforestation. Finally, the Bodo Liberation Tigers signed an accord with the central government, and the National Liberation Front of Bodoland declared a ceasefire in 2004. This allowed for the creation of the Bodoland Forest Protection Force and other community protection forces to initiate patrolling and protection of the Manas Biosphere Reserve in 2006. When we began work in 1998, we first had to convince some of our NGO partners that we needed to work directly with the communities. We then began to address many of the villages across the Manas Biosphere and some of the southern fragments around Kakajana Reserve Forest, Nottingiri Reserve Forest, and Chakrashila Wildlife Sanctuary. We began introducing them to planting tree nurseries and planting areas to restore the forest. As those progressed, we began helping the communities to create self-help groups to increase their incomes through micro-industries. Later, we began to coordinate seminars and bring together the participating communities, the NGOs, and the Assam Forestry and civilian government agencies. Those seminars eventually included members of the newly formed Bodoland Territorial Council. Finally, we held large Manas Biosphere celebrations. We also involved communities in conducting censuses of the golden langurs and in some ecotourism programs. The forest committees and the self-help groups overlapped a great deal, which had a good result of increasing the trust of the NGOs by the community members. Communities could begin to see the results of their plantings with well over 100,000 saplings. This began to encourage groups who were feeling empowered to patrol the forest to stop others from cutting the forest. They also created federations around the protection of their forests. The Golden Langur Conservation Project began with an NGO, Nature's Foster, and a CBO, Green Forest Conservation. Later, others joined, and we formed the Manas Biosphere Conservation Forum. Each group focused on specific areas. Green Forest Conservation focused on the large western area of the biosphere. Green Heart Nature Club focused on Chakrashila Wildlife Sanctuary and Nottingiri Reserve Forest. New Horizon focused on the central area of the biosphere, and Nature's Foster focused on Kakajana Reserve Forest. Aranyak from Guwahati helped with the initial financial administration of the project. Kakajana began as a model project. Nature's Foster focused on the 28 communities surrounding the Kakajana Reserve Forest, which was almost completely deforested by 1998. They involved the communities in reforestation and self-help groups. Neighboring villages were encouraged to work with each other, and eventually 2 federations were formed to protect the forests. One is composed of 16 villages called Padaswari Golden Langur Green Forest Federation, and the other is composed of the 14 villages making up Sipanshila. This map is an example of how specific communities had specific areas which they planted and protected. There are stories I want to tell you about these 4 communities that indicated an empowered group in each case. Kendrabil is a Bodo tribal community. They told us how they had watched others cut down their sal forest 3 times and how bad they felt, but they would not let it happen again. They have placed signs proclaiming their protective ownership. Other communities, in response, seeing their signs, have followed suit on adjacent forests. This is the conservation contagion. Gendrabil began replanting some forests and watched other areas regrow. As the forest returned, small antelopes called muntjacs returned as well. Hunters then set up hides to kill the antelopes, but the members of Gendrabil broke down the hides and stopped the hunting. In Lalkura, a village mainly of Santal people, the women stopped outside women from cutting their forest and told them to grow their own firewood as they were doing. Then they culled some shrubs and gave it to the encroachers to use for fuel wood. Sipunchila, a complex of villages, created a community-based organization and organized 200 villagers to go and stop all woodcutters. Being located at the main entrance to the forest, they have functioned to stop most of the woodcutters coming into the forest. Giaguri, a small Raba tribal community, sent 2 men out each morning to patrol their forest. After a year, all cutting had been stopped. The result of the Golden Langur Conservation Project is that over the whole range of the Golden Langur, the population has increased from 1,500 langurs in 1999 to 5,580 in 2008. Kakajana Reserve Forest, which had less than 100 langurs in 1998, had over 500 by 2009. The langur population responded to the return of the forest. In 1996, there was only about 5% canopy. By 2008, the canopy had increased to about 70% canopy. Although we were worried about how langurs would be able to move between isolated forest fragments in the south, a recent migration occurred showing us that there were already functioning corridors that needed to be strengthened. A subgroup of 4 langurs left the east side of Kakajana, perhaps feeling they needed more room. One afternoon, Arnab Bose and I followed their trail by motorcycle, asking villagers along the route whether they had seen any langurs. The langurs had crossed a bridge and another stream somehow. The red lines show their route. They had gone about 10 kilometers, and we were able to locate them in a small village at the western end of the red line. Eventually, they reached Bhumeshwar, another forest island at the bottom left corner of the map. We now have a grant to strengthen these corridors connecting many of the larger island forests. These islands, which we thought would eventually lose their langur populations, are now seen as potential habitat for viable populations of golden langurs. Based on the community success at Kakajana, we think that within 10 years we will have viable langur populations of 1,000 to 2,000 animals on either side of the river within the green circle. In 2005, we had 4 celebrations of the Manas Biosphere Reserve that brought the extended community together. People from across the biosphere attended them, as well as members of the NGOs and government agencies. The initial celebrations in the center of the Biosphere Reserve had 8,000 and 5,000 participants. The third celebration on the western boundary of the biosphere hosted 20,000 participants, and the fourth on the eastern boundary of the biosphere had 35,000 participants. As more community groups were forming and were starting to patrol the forests of the Biosphere Reserve, Rajan Islari of Green Forest Conservation approached Kampa Borgoyari, Minister of the Environment of the newly formed Bodoland Territorial Council. He told the minister that if he could get small financial support of $400 US per year per man, he would pick 100 men to form the first Bodoland Forest Protection Force. Within 7 months after they were formed, they were already stopping much of the illegal logging and had confiscated $100,000 US worth of logs and illegal materials. These pictures show the Kachagan camp with the Bodoland Forest Protection Forces and the logs and bicycles that they confiscated. They patrol by truck and bicycle in large groups, but without weapons. There are now 11 community forest protection forces that work with the Assam Forest Department staff, 10 of which are shown in this map of the biosphere. The arrows indicate which areas they patrol. The 4 western groups, managed by Green Forest Conservation, the Biodiversity Conservation Society, New Horizon, and Raigajli Ecotourism and Social Welfare Society, work directly with the Golden Langur Conservation Project. The other 7 CBOs, clustered in the eastern biosphere around Manas National Park, form a federation with the 4 western CBOs that is headed by Rajan Islari. Together, they have confiscated over $300,000 US of illegal materials and have stopped about 80% of the illegal logging. The bases for success are listed on this slide. The amount of conservation contagion built up slowly and accelerated after 7 or 8 years. A total of 13 empowered community groups are now protecting most of the geographic range of the Golden Langur, approximately 250 to 300,000 hectares, which has resulted in a major increase in the focal species, the Golden Langur. The celebrations reached probably over 40,000 people, mostly villagers, across the Manas Biosphere Reserve. About 70% of the biosphere, that is reserve forest, had never been protected before. The only things lacking at this point is to formalize and legalize this community protection system under the Bodoland Territorial Council and the Assam Forest Department to get sustainable funding for the forest protection forces and to begin training these forces as co-managers with the Bodoland and Assam governments. These communities stepped forward to do what had never been done before. We began to work with Mark Fenn, who worked with WWF, to set up a community co-management system in southwest Madagascar in the Toliara district. We began with a workshop using this series of presentations and group exercises. There were 45 participants from WWF and other regional NGOs and community groups, as well as ANGAP that manages the protected areas. The government of Madagascar has created a number of laws and policies to encourage community co-management. From the workshop and another workshop that WWF and ANGAP coordinated with communities, the participants put together this map. There is thus a system in place with community co-management proposed areas surrounding existing protected areas within the whole Toliara district. The focus is currently on ringtail lemurs that occur in 4 groups somewhat dependent on freshwater springs. Another community east of this one that has mouse and ringtail lemurs in Veros Sifakas has formed a community group as well. This whole project is just in its early stages of development. We are helping to create and train an NGO, Cultures and Conservation, in the Toliara South area to work with 4 communities to protect 15,000 hectares of dry, spiny forest with ringtail lemurs, mouse lemurs, radiated tortoises, and a number of bird and reptile species. A community group has been formed from the 4 villages, and 4 tree nurseries have been started with a reforestation program of mangroves and other species. A new protected area named Sinjoriaki protected area has been mapped and created. Sinjoriaki means seeing the sea in Malagasy. A community research project has begun on the population of ring-tailed lemurs, which is relatively small, having been decimated by capture for the pet trade. We are using this research as a way of involving the community in protecting this population of lemurs. We have joined with the Neotropical Primate Conservation run by Sam and Noga Shawnee to help them with the project they initiated in the cloud forests of northern Peru, focused on the protection of the highly endangered and endemic yellow-tailed woolly monkeys. We began our work with them by co-coordinating a workshop using these lectures given to most of the stakeholders focused on the species and the cloud forests. We are using a model similar to the Assam project to try and catalyze communities to protect the cloud forest and its primates and other endangered endemic species like the pudu, a small antelope, the spectacled bear, and the whiskered owlet. The yellow-tailed woolly monkey conservation project, being carried out by the Neotropical Primate Conservation through the workshop with stakeholders, is focusing on connecting corridors between the existing forest fragments and primate populations as one conservation strategy, as seen in the map on the left. We hope to coordinate additional workshops to catalyze more community reserves in the future. Thanks to all our sponsors who made all of this work possible.